So I just want to extend thanks on behalf of the Environmental Management Authority for inviting us to present at your session today. I also want to take the opportunity to wish you Happy World Environment Day. World Environment Day was on Sunday 5th. And then, of course, World Oceans Day was on June 7th. So just to set the tone for the presentation, in commemoration of World Environment Day, the EMA launched a video, a very simple representation of the role of the EMA. So I will share that video with you first before we go into the presentation. So just allow me a minute for me to get that video started.
The environment is all around us. It is our rivers and oceans, our beaches and forests, the air we breathe and our climate system. It includes all living creatures on land and in the ocean. It is our built environment and the infrastructure between it. The environment includes us. The natural resources of Trinidad and Tobago form the basis of the economy, and the quality of the environment directly impacts our health and quality of life. Sustainably managing our interactions with the environment is essential for ensuring that the needs of this and future generations are met. The Environmental Management Authority, EMA, was established in 1995 under the Environmental Management Act to coordinate the over 50 state agencies with responsibility for enforcing environmental laws. The EMA is responsible for developing and revising the National Environmental Policy in consultation with all interest groups. The EMA and the stakeholders are encouraged to conduct their operations in accordance with the objectives of the policy. The EMA was mandated to create and enforce subsidiary legislation under the Environmental Management Act, Chapter 3505. Some of the critical regulations enforced by the EMA include the Certificate of Environmental Clearance (CEC) Rules 2001 that regulate certain types of development activities. The Water Pollution Rules 2019 that control and manage point and non-point sources of water pollution. The Noise Pollution Control Rules 2001 as amended that regulate sound from fixed sources. The Air Pollution Rules 2014 that regulate point and non-point sources of air emissions. The Environmentally Sensitive Species Rules 2001 that designate and protect specific species. The Environmentally Sensitive Areas Rules 2001 that designate and protect specific areas. The Waste Management Rules 2021 that regulate the generation and handling of waste. Several of these regulations involve issuing and monitoring permits. For example, a certificate of environmental clearance may be issued for 44 different types of activities, ranging from large-scale oil exploration to a privately owned automotive repair garage. In addition to issuing and monitoring permits, the EMA responds to environmental emergencies and investigates environmental complaints. Environmental breaches can lead to the offender being served a legal document called a Notice of Violation. The Environmental Police Unit, or EPU, are special reserve police officers assigned to the EMA. They monitor the compliance of events with noise permits and can enforce any law in Trinidad and Tobago, including those under the Environmental Management Act. The EMA is responsible for increasing environmental awareness. Its public education arm promotes environmentally responsible behaviors through national campaigns, workshops, education programs, presentations, and exhibitions. The EMA undertakes special projects, including those that are funded by the Green Fund. From young to old, city to village, The EMA is committed to facilitating cooperation and coordination among all persons towards the wise use of our environment. Creating a better tomorrow is possible with the EMA and you.
Okay, so I hope everyone was able to view and hear the video. So that gives us a nice overview of the presentation in a simple way. So as we know, today we're going to be looking at environmental management in Trinidad and Tobago, and we're going to have some focus on the national environmental policy and how our environments are managed from the EMA's perspective. Okay. So we're going to cover the policy, which in short, I'm going to refer to as the NEP. So when you hear NEP, I'm referring to the National Environmental Policy. We're going to have a look at the Environmental Management Act, Chapter 3505, and then zero in a little bit, as the video outlined, but in some more detail on the role of the EMA in environmental management. So the first thing that we're going to look at is the NEP 2018. And this is actually the overarching framework for environmental management in Trinidad and Tobago. And this was revised in 2018. The iteration before this was the 2006 version. Okay, so why is this policy so important? The first thing is that it is a requirement of the Environmental Management Act. Okay, Section 18 of the Act mandates that the EMA develops the NEP and revise it from time to time. So we are fulfilling that legal requirement. And of course, it outlines some basic governance principles by which we are to develop environmental laws, environmental programs, policies, any actions. And those principles can be in line, for example, with sustainable development, with prevention, with the polluter pays principle, and so on. And of course, the revised NEP ensured that it was relevant to our current dynamic. The issues that we are facing now, and we know with time, this changes. So we want to ensure that this document addresses those topics sufficiently. Okay. So the NEP, when we speak about relevance and where we want to go with it, the 2018 NEP is also closely aligned to Vision 2030, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals. So as you peruse the document, you will actually see the references to the various SDGs in the different areas. Okay. So just to give you an idea of some of the objectives, I'm not going to go through all, but just to zero in on some. One, of course, is to ensure that we integrate sustainable development principles, that is taking the environment, the society, and the economy into consideration, international policies and programs, provide incentives to reduce pollution in all its forms. And we will cover the different forms of pollution in a later slide. Promoting research, of course, into alternative sources of energy. And this is very important considering our commitments to reduce our carbon footprint and our reliance on fossil fuels. And of course, the policy also encourages the development of other national policies, local and so on, as needed. And of course, these things cannot be achieved if we do not do it in a collaborative way. So it speaks to cooperation among government, civil society, as well as the corporate sector and any other entity. Of course, very important, conservation of diversity in all its forms, all right, and ensuring that people feel empowered to actually act in a positive way and to execute what is necessary to attain sustainable development. All right, promotion of environmental awareness at all levels, and that involves from preschool age all the way up to adulthood, ensuring that we reach the most vulnerable in society as well, women, children, the elderly, and so on. And very relevant to a small island developing states such as ours in the context of climate change. It speaks to the reduction of greenhouse gases, as well as enhancing our resilience, socially as well with respect to our ecosystems, as we attempt to adapt to the effects of climate change. So that's some of the objectives in a nutshell. And just to give you an idea of what went into developing the National Environmental Policy, and this is important because it was a very robust participatory process, and it utilized multiple strategies of engagement. And this was important because the idea was to get a policy that truly represented the views of the people of Trinidad and Tobago in all sectors. All right, so one of the first things that was used was the data received from a National Environmental Awareness and Literacy Survey. There were also thematic focus group meetings that were done with representatives from the public, private sector, as well as civil society, and an expert panel. So that would have fed into the first draft. And then when we got into the other phases, the next would have been a very intensive mass engagement to obtain feedback via the website from the citizenry of Trinidad and Tobago, including the conduct of public consultations. And of course, under the EM Act, we were required to have the public comment process, and that further fed into other iterations that would have resulted in the final National Environmental Policy. Now, this policy, more importantly, okay, it represents the people of Trinidad and Tobago and what is required to achieve sustainability. It is not an EMA policy, and I think it is important to state that it belongs to all of us, and we all have a role to ensure that what is in the policy is actually implemented. So it's laid out in a different format from previous iterations. There are 6 thematic areas, and these thematic areas are in no order of importance, okay? So, and they're all represented by icons. So if you look at the middle, you'd see an orange icon with the house and the tree, okay? So that represents improving the local environment, for example. Okay, so these are the priorities that were identified as being critical in the policy to achieving sustainability. Okay, so the first one I'm going to look at is protecting environmental and human health through pollution control. So this section actually states commitments that will reduce or minimize levels of pollution. And we know that with consumption and production, you know, there will be byproducts. And if those byproducts are not managed, then pollution becomes a big issue. So it speaks to the different commitments for dealing with air pollution, noise pollution, water pollution, solid and hazardous waste, including light pollution. Okay. Sustainably managing our natural assets. And of course, this looks at how we use our natural resources in a wise way. So It doesn't just address, for example, because some of the first things that will come to mind will be our mineral and hydrocarbon management and our water resource management, but it really pulls out all of these natural assets, for example, soil and land management, biodiversity management. And I know this audience, you would particularly recognize the importance of biodiversity management. Okay. And following that, we look at improving the local environment. And this thematic area takes a holistic view on how we plan our human settlements in a strategic way, ensuring that we have communities that are safe, communities that are resilient, that are inclusive, taking all the factors into consideration, how we construct our buildings, green architecture, integrating our culture and heritage and our national festivals and so on into the way we live and we coexist, and having the right infrastructure in place that will add or enhance our quality of life. Evolving a greener economy. Now this one basically speaks to integrating environmental considerations into the way we do business, with the aim of increasing our productivity and our economic growth. All right. So we want to ensure that collaboratively, we reconsider how we revalue our waste streams. We consider the recirculation of our resources, we increase our efficiency. The commitments will mention things like, encouraging sustainable livelihoods, and so on. So this really speaks to that whole triple bottom approach, where people benefit, the environment benefits, and we have, economic gain as well, all right? And fostering an environmentally responsible society, a place where everyone feels empowered to improve the environment, enhance it, and they understand their role. Okay, and there are several sections, and the commitments here speak to people having availability of and public access to information. And that could include databases or whatever they need to access to get a better understanding of the environment and how they can address the environmental issues, being able to participate, including the most vulnerable in decision-making, being able to conduct research, and of course, access to and implementation of environmental justice. And finally, but of course, just as important as all of the other priorities, addressing climate change and environmental and natural disasters. And there are 3 sections with commitments and recommended actions here for mitigation, that's reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and in line with our commitments under the Paris Agreement, the implementation of strategies to cope with the effects of climate change through adaptation, and very relevant as well is increasing our resilience. How do we prepare, respond, and recover from environmental and natural disasters? All right, so we know that, and I mentioned it before, in order to implement and achieve the policy actions, because very often it is good to see a well laid out policy, but implementation is key. And that was recognized when this policy was drafted. And so they tried to address it in the policy. So of course, it encourages stakeholder collaboration at all levels, including between institutions and across, regionally and internationally, in order to implement what is stated in the policy. And in order to monitor and evaluate, one of the recommendations in the policy, it speaks to the development of a national environmental policy action plan. Okay, and under Section 302, the EMA is charged with the responsibility of developing that action plan. And within it, it basically would itemize, the responsibilities, the timelines, the indicators and targets and so on to be achieved. All right. It also speaks to the development or the formation of a National Council for Sustainable Development, or NCSD. That's the acronym. Now, in the 2006 iteration of the policy, they would have suggested this council, but in this policy, it is mandated. All right. So what has happened since the policy came into effect basically is that the EMA1 would have drafted an action plan, but in 2020, the NCSD was appointed by cabinet, and it was although the EMA was charged with the responsibility of developing the policy, we thought it would be best if the NCSD and the working groups that were formed under each thematic area would have input into the development of the action plans for each thematic area. So there are working groups that were formed to work with the NCSD on the different thematic areas. Okay, the EMA has the responsibility of reporting on the implementation, and we do that through the annual assessment of the state of the environment report, part A of the report. If any of you have seen any of the reports since 2018, you would note that part A is sectioned off and aligned with the thematic areas of the NEP, with specific targets being mentioned under each thematic area. And each year, the EMA will add to those indicators through collaboration and cooperation with different stakeholders, because that is key to getting the information to share it. Another thing that they would have done, if there was an invitation for the a call for submission of projects, a national call for projects that will link to the different thematic areas. So this is a database that the EMA would have started, and they use that information and they report on it in the assessment of the state of the environment report. One of the ways they've done that is a mapping exercise where for each thematic area on a map of Trinidad, they pin the project. So if you click on that particular location, the information regarding that project will come up. So that's just to give you a sense of what has happened since the NEP was laid in Parliament. Of course, there's a lot more to do. Some working groups are more active than others, but the work is ongoing, right? And also to mention that EMA recently developed our new strategic plan, and that too is closely aligned to the thematic areas of the National Environmental Policy. All right, so that's, so I'm just going to transition now from the NEP a bit into the role of the EMA. I'm just going to add some more meat to what you would have seen in the video that was shown at the beginning of the presentation. Right, so the EMA was established by the government of Trinidad and Tobago, and on June 5th, 1995, our anniversary, our birthday is on World Environment Day. And it is a requirement. The formation of the EMA was a requirement under the Environmental Management Act. Now, the Act speaks to the establishment of the EMA, as well as the establishment of an environmental trust fund, which is different from the Green Fund, and the establishment of an environmental commission, which is a superior court of record, which can deliberate over any decision made by the EMA. Okay, and why was the EMA formed? I mean, you would have heard it in the video. It was to help to coordinate the over 50 state agencies that had some sort of remit for environmental issues. Of course, in addition to having a coordinating body, it has the responsibility of doing this in different ways, addressing our environmental problems. And what is important is the EMA is protection is part of what we do, but our aim really is to see how best we can balance development with the environment, ensure that we use our resources in a way that future generations can still, benefit from what we benefit from now, okay? So we do this through 3 core areas. One of them is coordination, and we would understand that, there are several cross-cutting issues when we speak about environmental management. So for example, when we were designating the environmentally sensitive, the sea turtles as environmentally sensitive species, we would have had to, ensure that we consulted with, and we had consensus, with all the stakeholders that were involved in managing the 5 sea turtles. So that would have included, the EMA, Forestry Division's Wildlife Section, Fisheries Division, the Coast Guard, the police, the TTPS, so it's the NGOs that are involved in sea turtle conservation. Okay, we also have the environmental officers program called the EO program. We revived that program last year. So we have representatives from different state agencies and corporations and so on, who we have quarterly meetings with. And it really is to keep the lines of communication open so that we can work closer to manage, the various environmental issues. Education, okay, that is one of the roles of the EMA. And this is done in a, we are mandated actually under the EM Act to implement national environmental and education programs. We do it utilizing various methods. We develop educational tools, workshops, different campaigns, programs targeting different audience from the very young to the very old, community programs, programs that target private sector. Part of it is outreach as well, dealing with doing exhibitions and lectures. What I'm doing today is part of our outreach as well. Okay, and we also produce literature, publications and so on, not just on the work of the EMA, but we're required to do it as well on any topic, environmental topic of relevance. Okay, so climate change education is something that we do as well. Right, and this is probably the role we're best known for, and that is as a regulator. Okay, so we're required to write and implement environmental standards, laws, and regulations. And of course, we have to ensure that we enforce and monitor the various standards and regulations that are written. Okay, so right now, we are in the process of designating the red howler monkey and the white-fronted capuchin monkey. Okay, so the last law that we would have passed would have been the waste management rules, and that was in 2021, which actually became operational at the end of May this year. Right, so this here is just a bird's eye view of our suite of legislation that governs the work of the EMA when it comes to environmental management. So the primary legislation up to the top corner, well, my left, would be the Environmental Management Act, and everything else would be the subsidiary legislation. So there are some that would address the different types of pollution, like the water pollution rules, for instance. And then you have the Certificate of Environmental Clearance rules, which deals with development activities, and the environmentally sensitive areas and species rules that would, in a more direct way, address the biodiversity issues. So I will just touch on these individually so you get a better sense of how we use the legislation. So for the Certificate of Environmental Clearance rules, anyone who is planning to start, modify, expand, close down, abandon a business or project, as prescribed in the 44 designated activities under the designated activities order, is required to apply for a certificate of environmental clearance. Now, the 44 activities, actually, they're numbered And for each activity, there's a definition that will guide you as to whether or not you need to apply for that activity. So for example, activity 1 speaks to like animal production. So let's say you have 2 pigs, then you wouldn't need to apply for a CC. But if you have excess of 25, then you're required to apply. So the definition really guides you. And of course, if people are still in doubt, they can come in to do pre-application meetings, get the sort of advice they need, and, you know, or they just apply, right? When you apply for a CC really is a permit which certifies the environmental acceptability of your project. If it is done a certain way, if you adhere to the conditions that are in the permit, basically. Okay, so once you apply, the EMA may say, okay, you don't need a CC, or if you do, you may need an EIA or environmental impact assessment or not. Okay, and then once we get all the information that we need, they will determine whether or not to grant the CC. If the CC is not granted, then the applicant has the option of appealing that decision to the Environmental Commission. Okay, so we're going to go into some of the rules that deal with pollution. So the very topical topic of noise pollution, we have the noise pollution control rules, and it basically sets out to do that, to help to control noise levels. So it sets standards for different areas, right? So you have standards for industrial areas, environmentally sensitive areas, and general areas. So everything that falls outside of industrial and environmentally sensitive falls into general. So I extracted general so you get an idea of what the noise prescribed standards are for this particular category. So it's separated into daytime standards and nighttime standards and the duration of sound. So for example, if you look at continuous sound, the standard there during the day between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. is 80 decibels, okay? And during the night, it's 65 decibels. So give you an idea of how loud that is, a ringing telephone is about 60 decibels, right? And then if it's something instantaneous, like very short sound, short period of time, then during the day it's about 120 decibels, which is equivalent to about the sound that you get from a jackhammer. Okay, so anyone wishing to exceed the prescribed standards for the different zones are required to apply for noise variation. And part of that is, you know, advertising their event, their activity in the newspaper so that people can send in their comments and their feedback. And the EMA takes that into consideration with all the other information they get from the applicant as to whether or not to grant the noise variation. If you are granted the noise variation, it has conditions because it is a permit that you are to adhere to. So, for example, it will tell you by how much you can exceed the standard and over what period. Okay. The water pollution rules was actually first implemented in 2000. There's a 2001 version, but it was revised in 2019. And with the revision came some changes. Okay, so one of them was that it took a more integrated approach to watershed management. So it no longer just addressed point sources of pollution, like from a discrete opening like a pipe, but it also seeks to manage non-point sources of water pollution that you probably get from runoff, like from agricultural activity or runoff from city streets after rain, for example. Okay, and of course it encourages the reuse of water, right? Another thing too is that when it was revised, it was more closely aligned to the tenets of the polluter pays principle. So the fee structure and the formula for calculating that, it's different as well, okay? And there's no longer a source registration process, it's strictly permitting. So anyone who has a facility with a point source discharge, okay, they're required to apply. And once they apply, the EMA will notify them as to whether or not they require a permit, okay? Now, the permitting process is something that the EMA sort of would walk them through, but the idea is that during that 5-year period of the permit, that they will work to reduce their levels of water pollutants to the levels that are mentioned in Schedule 2 of the water pollution rules. Now there are exemptions. So like a household, for example, is not required to apply only if there's some sort of commercial activity attached to that household. Okay. The air pollution rules, similarly, it targets commercial activities, industrial activities. So if anyone wants to operate or is intending to operate an emitter facility, they must register. So Schedules 1 and 2 would identify those pollutants, and Schedule 3 lists all the activities that would, once you're doing any of those activities, you're required to register, okay? So unlike the water pollution rules, this has a source emitter registration process, and after they've registered, then they will be notified as to whether or not they require a permit, okay? So, I mean, the air pollution rules, like the water pollution rules, I mean, it seeks to help to minimize and control, okay, water pollutants as well as air pollutants, right? And the newest kid on the block, okay, would be the waste management rules, and it seeks to regulate activities related to waste management. And that could be activities dealing with waste generation, packaging to recycling, all right? And like the others, it has a permitting regime, okay? So anyone who is generating waste, you know, as outlined in the waste management rules, whether that's hazardous, any amount of hazardous waste, but for non-hazardous, the quantities are outlined in the waste management rules. They're required to apply for waste generators permit. And anyone who is receiving waste to process it, treat it, and so on, required to apply for a permit as a waste handler. Okay, so so that's basically what the waste management rule is intending to do. And we move on to the environmentally sensitive species rules, the objective of which is to help to conserve, protect different species. So far, the EMA has designated 11. I don't know if anyone can name all 11 species, but the last one to be designated was the scarlet ibis. And well, in front of you, I'm sure you'd be able to identify it easily. You have the white-tailed silver-winged hummingbird, which is found in Tobago. You have the pawi of Trinidad pipe and guan, and of course the manatees. All right, you have the 5 sea turtles, the ocelot, the golden tree frog, and so on. So we're just hoping that this year that we will complete the designation process for the monkeys that I mentioned earlier. And the environmentally sensitive areas rules, I mean, they seek to protect different areas, and these areas have, of course, you know, rich ecological value. Yaripo savannas, for example, you have the sundew there, so that's one of the environmentally sensitive areas. Matura National Park, which has the largest Mora forest in the country. It's home to the ocelot, the pawi, and then of course there's the River Swamp, which is the largest freshwater swamp in Trinidad and Tobago, and also home to the manatee as well. Okay, so I've mentioned a lot about these permits, but the EMA has the responsibility of monitoring these permits, right? And only appointed environmental inspectors are authorized, all right? And that includes our environmental police units. Okay. So basically, it is required by law that individuals and companies register as a source of pollutants, they apply for permits, and adhere to the requirements of the permits as well as the standards, right? So if they don't, then they would be issued a notice of violation, and that is what will start the whole enforcement proceedings, okay? As I mentioned, we have SRPs assigned to the EMA by the Commissioner of Police, and they are able to prosecute offenses under the EM Act, as well as all the other pieces of legislation I mentioned prior, in addition to being able to prosecute offenses under other local legislation, right? Whether it be the Litter Act or the Summary Offences Act. So what would be considered as a breach? Okay, I just pulled out an example here, noting that the EMA can only deal with issues that are in breach of our environmental requirements that are dictated under the EM Act and the subsidiary legislation. So an example of a breach for the CEC rules, for example, would be failure to apply for a CEC before the start of the activity. Okay, now, very often people start the activity and then they apply. That is in breach of the rules. Another breach that may come about under the CEC rules would be failure to adhere to the conditions in the CEC, all right? So then you're not adhering to the conditions in the permit, right? The EMA, of course, has a hotline that's operational between 8 a.m. and 4:30, and this is for environmental complaints. And we've tried to make it as easy as possible for persons to lodge their complaints. So you can do it via letter, via email at complaints@ema.co.tt. There's the complaints hotline number 226-4362. And more recently, we introduced a WhatsApp number, not for calls, but if persons would like to send in like locations and photos and so on regarding the complaint, if you go to the website, there is a tab that says, how can I help you? And that would assist you in completing the complaint form and so on. And then there's also the option to visit the EMA's help desk. You could always call and make an appointment for that as well. So once we get a complaint, what do we do? All right, we have our investigations, our complaints and investigations unit. So we have to determine the completeness of the complaint. So that may mean calling the complainant to ensure that we have the information that is required. And once we have the information, we then determine, is this something the EMA can address? If it's not under our remit, we will refer it to a relevant agency via letter. And if it is something we can address, it's assigned a file number. And so if the person calls to follow up on that particular complaint, they can give them, they could use that file number as their reference, okay? And of course, an EMA officer will conduct a site visit to investigate. If there's some sort of environmental emergency, which is a bit different, that would include things like an oil spill, some sort of chemical release, a fish kill, and so on, then there's a different number for that. Because remember, the complaints hotline is something that is between 8 and 4:30, but this is a 24-hour number for environmental emergencies at 680-9588. All right, so just wrapping up, I mean, for all of the rules and the information on the NEP and so on, if you need more information on it, we have our information center, and you can send an email to book an appointment if you wish to visit to conduct research. It also houses the National Register for the different rules. Or you can visit our website at ema.co.tt, or you can call us at 226-4EMA. And feel free to log into and to view our social media handles, our YouTube page, our Facebook and Instagram profile. Okay, so I thank you. And at this point in time, I guess we can have a little discussion if anyone has questions.